with section 4 of chapter 4, we get to our first major war of the school year. We will hit 5 major wars. This is the first, French and Indian. Then we get to the American Revolution, the War of 1812, the War with Mexico, and then we end the year with the Civil War. And this is called the French and Indian War, and it should probably be the French and Native American War, but they're actually on the same side. These guys are allies. They're fighting against the British. And this whole section is about how North America ends up being after this war. What is the fallout of this war, and how America, spoiler alert, wins this war, or is on the winning side of this war. And after this war, the British and the colonists are able to keep taking more land, and that confidence that they can win something gives the American colonists the idea that they can then fight for their own freedom and win and take this land for themselves. You better believe that the French and Indian War title will be on the test, and it specifically asks who's it between, and you need to know that it's between the French and the British, not the Native Americans. You have General Edward Braddock, who will definitely be on the test as well. General Edward Braddock is one of the major reasons why the British start losing this war, and it's a key that we're going to be looking at is their battle strategies that are not working out well, that then helps the American colonists in the next one. William Pitt will be on the test because Pitt, and this is where you get Pittsburgh from, is the reason why the British end up winning this war. The Treaty of Paris, 1763, is on the test, and we'll eventually get to another Treaty of Paris. That Treaty of Paris ends the American Revolution, so we'll get to the things that end the wars as well. So the French and Indian Wars ended by the Treaty of Paris of 1763. We'll get to the Treaty of Paris of 1783, which ends the American Revolution. And then Pontiac's War is also on the test because Pontiac is extremely important. It's the first time that a Native American tribe kind of stands up and says, hey, if we don't stand up to these colonists, they're going to keep taking all of our land, and we're no longer going to be allowed to really work here. And then the one thing, and live here, the one thing that is important is that the 7 Years' War and the French and Indian War are basically the same thing. They happen over the exact same time period. The French and the British are not only fighting in North America, they're fighting in Europe as well. So they give it to two different names sometimes, but for our purposes, the French and Indian War and the 7 Years' War are basically the same exact thing. When we left off in Section 3, we knew that George Washington had gone out into the Ohio River Valley and that things did not go well for him there. He only brought 150 guys with him, and he loses, but he is starting to get that legend about him that he's able to win or at least fight battles that he might not necessarily be able to win. So the French have a lot of North America, and they're friends with Native Americans, and this says they're on their way to being the masters of North America. This war, when it's over in 1763, stops that. The French are completely booted out, basically out of the entire continent, and the British are able to keep taking over pretty much everything that they want until the colonists stop them and make the continent theirs. And they worked with the alliances, means they were friends with Native Americans all over the place. And this is the St. Lawrence River, this red line that separates what is present-day Canada from New York, comes down into the Great Lakes, and eventually, if you follow it all the way through the different Great Lakes, you can end up where the Mississippi River will eventually take you all the way down to Louisiana. So the French are all over this area, and the British are starting to move their way further and further west. For a while, the French and the Native Americans fought the British in the New World without really help from Britain. It was pretty much just the colonists versus the French and the Native Americans. And that does not go well for the colonists because there's not a lot of them. They don't have a lot of supplies. And eventually in 1754, Britain appoints a general to go there. His name is General Edward Braddock, and he is the commander-in-chief of the British forces in America. And today, we actually call our president the commander-in-chief. So it's something that we kind of took from British culture, is that we put a guy in charge, and technically they're in charge of all of the armed forces, which General Edward Braddock was in charge of the armed forces for this war. And his goal was to drive the French out. But when you look at this picture, this is just a preview of what's going to be happening once this war starts. And then once again, what's going to happen in the American Revolution, where when you look at this picture, you can, even though these guys are in the foregrounds, the colors that they're wearing allow them to blend into the woods. They're blending into the trees, they're blending into the ground. This allows them to have some camouflage, where you can clearly see the British redcoats in the background. This is a huge problem for the British. The British believe that there are rules to war. They believe that you should be able to stand in a straight line and fire bullets at each other, and that people will not attack you if you're not standing in that straight line. They think that they're going to wear red, and that doesn't really matter because they're going to be open in the middle of fields. But the Native Americans and the French, and eventually the colonists adapt the same style of warfare as well, is more guerrilla warfare. It's being camouflaged, it's hiding in trees. It's like if you ever go paintballing or play laser tag, you're not just going to stand out in the middle of the field or in the middle of the room. You're going to go hide behind things. You're going to run behind a tree or run behind a wall and fire and then duck and cover and go run somewhere else. It's this hit, run, and hide technique. You're going to hit someone, you're going to run away, and you're going to hide. Then you're going to come back out and hit someone else, run away, and hide. That's the entire game plan, but the British don't do that, and the British refuse to change their fighting style. And it's going to be bad for them here, it's going to be bad for them in the American Revolution, and it's one of the major reasons why they lose. And it's just a terrible idea to wear red in the middle of the wilderness that is the New World at this point, because it's really easy to see them. Where if they were wearing blue, dark blue, or they were wearing brown, it'd be way easier for them to blend in. Braddock leaves Virginia and he brings 1,400, once again, red-coated British soldiers with him. And then there's a smaller force of blue-coated colonial militia. So this is the colonists, and that's why they're going to end up wearing blue eventually, which, once again, you may remember they're wearing blue because they were growing indigo, that plant that would dye all of their clothes blue. And in that militia is George Washington. So once again, he is off to go to the Ohio River Valley to fight the French, but now he's not in charge. And even though he's not in charge, he tells Braddock that marching in straight lines and wearing brightly colored clothes is not a good idea. That you can blatantly see you, which down here, if you check out this picture again, same thing. You can clearly see the guys wearing blue or red, but the guys that are wearing blue and brown are blending into the surroundings. And Braddock just doesn't care. Braddock says, I'm the commander of all of the armed forces. I know better than you do. The British have one of the best militaries on the planet. We're going to do great. And the problem is that they're not going to do great. This is the first time that someone's finally changing the rules of warfare on them. Instead of dictating all of the strategy and all of the planning of war, they're now the ones that have to adapt, and they're not adapting well. They're too arrogant. They're too good at war in their own eyes that they don't need to do that they can win any battle. And on July 9th, the French attack them because they can blatantly see the British in the middle of the field, in the middle of the woods, and the British are defeated. They lose 1,000 men, including General Edward Braddock. Washington, though, once again comes away unscathed. Washington leads the survivors back to Virginia. So they lose over 2/3 of their guys to this, and Washington goes back to the colonies with about 400 to 500 men as their leader, as the person that took them out of this dangerous situation and were able to save their lives. So this is now, once again, another battle that Washington is in. He's now 0 for 2. He wasn't in charge of this one, and he tried to warn them, but Edward Braddock didn't listen, and because he refused to take that advice of wearing darker clothes and trying not to march straight through the woods, he lost his life and a bunch of other British officers as well. And because of the fighting in North America, it helped start that war over in Europe. So now the British and the French are fighting in both spots. Britain versus France. I like to refer to the one in North America as the French and Indian War, and then the one over in Europe is the 7 Years' War. Still the same thing. It's still the British versus the French. They're just fighting on two different colonies. And it's early in the war that the British colonies lose a lot of lands, and they're driven back to that coastline that Nathaniel Bacon did not want to stay on, it's not until later on that the British are able to come and give them support and help them win this war. When you take a look at this battle picture, it kind of shows you and explains to you what the British were all about. This is an open field. This is the British just lined up in a straight line across that field, and they're going to use tactics and strategy and specific army skills that they constantly practice to fire strategically at the enemy that is standing across from them. And that this is not something that everyone else wants to do. Once they start coming over to the New World, it really is just guerrilla warfare, running through the woods, hiding and shooting people from the trees, and the British are not adapted to that yet. The war really takes the turn for the better for the British when William Pitt becomes in charge. He's the Prime Minister of Great Britain, which basically means he's kind of like a president, and he says that Great Britain will pay for all of the war supplies for the colonists. No matter the cost, that the British will pay for it. He basically says, go to the store, buy whatever you need, spend all of the money you need, and then get what you need to win this war. The problem is, and this is where the American Revolution comes into play, eventually he raises taxes on the colonists after the war to make the colonists pay for the massive debt that was racked up while the French and Indian War was going on. So if there's any one reason to look to, I say it's this. The American Revolution starts with this decision. It starts here. William Pitt, the guy that Pittsburgh is named after, maybe that's why the Penguins are so terrible, is that it's all their fault. It's all William Pitt's fault that this American Revolution is going to end up being started. Because when we get to chapter 5, it's all about taxes and how the colonists have no say in the taxes. And the king just keeps raising more, British Parliament keeps raising more, and they want more money to pay off a war that the colonists weren't really even a part of. They made the colonists, or basically told them that they could do whatever they wanted, get whatever you need, just win the war for us, and we'll totally clear you of all of that debt. But the British is not what they did. Remember, they already lied to the Iroquois Confederacy about giving them land. Now they're lying to the colonists about not having to pay them back. And that's what really this comes back to, is the raising of the taxes that causes the American Revolution. That's a huge turning point in the history of our world. So America basically exists today because of William Pitt. His game plan was to basically just go straight through the Ohio River Valley and then conquer what was French Canada. And he sends a guy named Jeffrey Amherst, which there's an Amherst College in New England as well, and a guy named James Wolfe. He sends them to North America from England and puts them in charge of winning this war. And the British forces that come over during this time period do very well. They take a whole bunch of different forts over, including Fort Duquesne, that original fort that George Washington could not take when he took only 150 guys. They renamed it Fort Pitt, and then that is what is now Pittsburgh. So William Pitt's decision does do really well. It helps them win the war, but the side effect is that the fallout from that decision eventually is going to cause the American Revolution. The war really basically comes to an end with the Battle of Quebec. Quebec is a place in Canada today, and it was the capital of New France, and everyone thought it was impossible to attack it because they had the high ground. Quebec was sitting on top of the St. Lawrence River, and there was cliffs, and James Wolfe has his troops at night go up that path on the sides of the cliff, so that way the French had no idea they were coming. He basically had them scale a mountain in order to be up on top of that hill on where Quebec was, so the next day they could fight on a field, which was the British strategy. They wanted to fight on a field, and they were able to get there. So the picture depicts these redcoats climbing up the side of the cliff in order to be able to get up on top, so that way the next day they can line up in their normal straight lines and just fire back and forth at each other. So this was the way that the British were going to win, and that is the reason why they do win. And when you look at places like Quebec today, Quebec and Montreal have a very large French influence on their culture, on their food, on their languages, on their architecture, and that's because the French had owned this. And today, even to today, technically Canada is still owned by England, which dates back all the way to this war, where the Queen of England is on Canadian money, and technically the Queen is in charge of Canada, but they still get to be their own country. And it dates all the way back to the late 1750s, 1760s time period. So that fall of Quebec basically ends this war. But there's always a final battle and then a final piece of paper that says the war is over. So the final piece of paper for this one is the Treaty of Paris of 1763. I call this the Treaty of Paris Part 1 because we're going to get to the Treaty of Paris Part 2, the sequel, later on at the end of the American Revolution. And in this, France basically loses everything. It ends up ending France as a power in North America. And the continent ends up just being split between the British and the Spanish. And when you check out this map over here, Britain has yellow. So Britain had what was the 13 colonies. And now they've taken all of this French land that goes through Canada, down past the Mississippi River, and then all the way back up to where the 13 colonies were. The big part of this is a lot of this land in northern Canada isn't usable, so it looks like a lot of land, but it's really not that resourceful. It doesn't give them any money at all. But they are able to start expanding into what we know as the rest of America today. The Spanish have basically everything west of the Mississippi River, all the way down to where this is the Rocky Mountains, so they can't really go past that, and they still own basically all of what is Mexico, Central America, and South America as well. And there is one tiny little spot of Santo Domingo that is French down here, and that's pretty much it. That's all they get left over. The Spanish and the British split up everything else on the continent, and the French basically go away for now. Once we get to Chapter 5 and Chapter 6 is when the French come back and help the colonists in order to help kick out the British. But now that the Native Americans are still living on that land, the French are going away and the colonists are moving in. And remember that the colonies and the colonists do not interact well. They don't play well with the Native Americans. The Native Americans have lost friends, they lost their allies, they lost land, they lost trading partners. The Native Americans definitely do not come out of this well. And what the British do is, because now the British are the only people there that the Native Americans can trade with, they decide to just raise prices on everything, supply and demand. The British literally have all of the supply. They're the only ones you can buy from. They also refuse to pay for lands from Native Americans. They just kept taking it and killing them or making them move further west. And so the Native Americans keep spreading further and further west, while the colonists just keep taking more and more land. And eventually there is a guy that tries to stand up to them. There's a chief of an Ottawa village near Detroit named Pontiac, and Pontiac starts his own war. He tries to unite Native American groups to fight the British, and this should sound familiar to you. He had seen the Iroquois Confederacy, the IC, Iroquois Confederacy. This is what we got the Albany Plan of Union from, and eventually becomes how we connect together as 13 colonies to become one country. So Pontiac sees that we're getting absolutely wrecked. The colonists are going to keep coming. He's able to gather a bunch of Native American tribes to work together. Remember, instead of just one finger poking someone, you put all of your fingers together as a fist, and you can do a lot more damage. And over 2 years, Pontiac wins a bunch of different battles. He's able to take some land back in Pennsylvania and Virginia. But as with most things with the Native Americans, the British come back and beat them. They defeat Pontiac and his allies, and they force Pontiac to sign a treaty, which I think is a little bit of a difference of saying you're going to sign this treaty or we're going to kill you versus them signing it willingly, but Pontiac still signs a treaty and says, I'm not going to keep fighting this war with you. But once again, we have a picture that can show us how this is going to work during the American Revolution. That you still have the British wearing redcoats, you still have them lining in straight up lines, trying to go through the woods, and you have people that have better camouflage and better fighting techniques for that environment. And because the British refused to adapt, eventually, once the French and the colonists and the Native Americans, and you have the Spanish, you have the Prussians, you have Cuba, you have all of these different places working together to beat the British, and they refuse to adapt their fighting style, that is going to be their downfall. And along with Pitt, and how Pitt said, we'll pay for the entire war, don't worry about it, there's another major thing that kind of starts making the Americans really mad. It makes the colonists angry, and we're going to be doing this a lot in the next chapter. The colonists will become very angry throughout chapter 5 to the point where they start a revolution. Right at the end of the war, with the Treaty of Paris of 1763, the British also signed the Proclamation of 1763, where they set a boundary for the colonists at the Appalachian Mountains. So this was what we knew as the 13 colonies. That is in this dark orange on this map, right on the Atlantic Ocean coastline. And that's where they tell the colonists they have to stay. Even though the colonists just did a whole bunch of work to win that war, they tell them you are not allowed to move past those mountains. That all of this new land is for Britain and Britain only. And you are not British, you are colonists. And that starts to make the colonists extremely angry that they thought of themselves as British. They just fought for the British in the British War. We're going to talk about how George Washington literally just fought as a British general, and now he's going to be turning and going and fighting for the Americans instead. And it was a part of that, all of this new land gets them the British a bunch of money. And if they're allowing the colonists to go into this land, the colonists will get a piece of that money, and they don't want them to. So not only did they tell them, you're not going to have to pay for the war, don't worry about it, but now, and then they eventually make them pay for it, they're also telling them you can't go take more land, which was the entire purpose of the war in the first place. So the Proclamation of 1763 and William Pitt going back on his deal, two major events in a series of events that will kick off the American Revolution, which we'll get to all of those in chapter 5.